And welcome to Salon Talks. I'm Dean Obeidallah, and today we have with us a Nobel Prize-winning economist. I've never spoken to a Nobel Prize-winning economist, so this is a big thrill. Joseph Stiglitz, whose great book, The Price of Inequality, a few years ago, great bestseller. A brand new book out now, People, Power, and Profits, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. He also served as chair of Bill Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors. Joseph, welcome to Salon Talks. Great to chat with you.
Nice to be here.
Your book is great, and I'm going to go through it. It gives us a history of how we got here and prescriptions going forward. But first, we're in the heart of the 2020 campaign. We need to define terms before the people on the right define them inaccurately, because they're trying to do that every day. First of all, you have actual 2020 candidates asked if they embrace capitalism. Can you explain to us from an economic point of view simply what is capitalism?
So these are words that we create to try to summarize a complex economic system.
Right.
And it used to be that the word capitalism was used pejoratively.
Right.
It was capital, the owners of the means of production were using their economic power to exploit workers. And then Milton Friedman turned it around and said, you know, capitalism is a virtue, not a vice. Mm-hmm. And said it's what makes our economy great.
Okay.
So capitalism became a good thing then. Now, back in those days, socialism was about government ownership of the means of production.
Right.
Now, you notice, have you heard any political candidate on any spectrum saying the government should take over the steel mills or the coal mines?
No, of course not.
Of course not. So we're not talking about socialism. We're not talking about Maduro in Venezuela. We're not talking about that.
So socialism really is the government takes over the means of production, banks, farms, companies, and then dictates what will be produced, what's not going to be produced, picks essentially the winners and losers of our economy. Is that accurate?
That was socialism 100 and some years ago.
So that's what it meant more in a classical definition of socialism.
In the classical definition. And after the experiences of the last 150 years, no one is in favor of that kind of socialism. But there's a very different kind of in Europe, it's called social democrats.
Sure.
In Europe, sometimes there are even parties called socialist parties, but they don't believe in the classical form of socialism. If you listen carefully the other night at the Fox News town hall, mm-hmm. Where Bernie Sanders said, or tried to articulate what he stood for, he said he thinks the economy ought to be serving individuals. Who can be against that?
Right.
That the purpose of the economy is to serve society, not the other way around. So that is what he means mm-hmm. by democratic socialism. So the kinds of agenda that he's talking about are things that, again, most Americans believe. Social Security.
Sure.
Back when Franklin Roosevelt introduced Social Security, some people called it socialist.
Yep.
Everybody's in favor of
Sure.
Social Security. I don't know anybody who says, because I'm in favor of Social Security, I'm a socialist. No, nobody would say that. When Lyndon Johnson introduced Medicare, some of the Republicans said, mm-hmm. that's socialism. Today, you ask one person on Medicare whether they're a socialist. No.
I mean, the Republicans even had Ronald Reagan going around the country then, representing, I think, a lobbying firm. He wasn't a governor then, talking about so Medicare is socialism.
Yeah.
At the same exact language we hear today.
Yeah, and the fact is, it produced a health care for the aged that has worked and has been one of the reasons why we've had extended longevity.
Interesting.
So again, it's part of making sure that everybody in the country has access to health care is part of the social democratic agenda in Europe and part of what's called the democratic socialist agenda in the United States. No one could disagree with that. Access to education
right. for
everybody. Now, is that socialism? I don't think so. I think that's, again, good investment. If I were trying to say, what is the most important investment that a society can make? It's in their people.
Sure.
if you're born poor, you don't have the wherewithal to make those investments. So for society to make those investments and then reap the returns, the guy is going to be making higher incomes, and because he's making higher income, he'll be paying more taxes. The government will get back the return in the form of higher taxes. That's just good investment policy. So I wouldn't call that socialist. I would call that just good policy.
I agree with you, and it's great you pointed out, on the right, Medicare, Social Security, even the ACA was called socialism. To them, it seems like if it's not helping corporations or the top 1%, it's socialism. The only thing that's not socialism is that. With tax cut for the wealthy, sure, that's great. And the rest isn't. Now your book, People, Power, and Profits, the title continues, Progressive Capitalism for an Age of Discontent. And I know you recently wrote an article for the New York Times talking about this idea. It's not an oxymoron. Explain, because we're a progressive audience, we're progressives here. How can you be a progressive and a capitalist at the same time? How it works, how it's not inconsistent?
So what I mean by progressive capitalism is the word capitalist is to remind us that the market is going to be a big part of the economy. Mm-hmm. None of us want to run steel mills or coal mines. But there are many things that the market on its own won't provide, like good annuities, healthcare, unemployment insurance. You tell me what private company is providing unemployment insurance, all these other forms of social protection. So to me, what I see progressive capitalism is just another way of saying a mixed economy with better balance between the market and collective action, between the state. I also include civil society here because that's an important part of our institutional structure. I come from universities. Some of our best universities are not state universities. They're not-for-profits. Mm-hmm. They're not for-profits. The only for-profit universities are things like Trump universities that have excelled in only one thing, figuring out how to rob people's pockets and exploit the most vulnerable members of our society. So when we start thinking about how our economy actually works, it actually has a broad ecology of institutional arrangements. And what I'm calling for in progressive capitalism is just a shorthand for saying let's get a better balance, that we need the state collective action not only to temper the market, to make sure we don't pollute the environment, have banks that engage in excessive risk-taking or in abusive practices, that we have adequate safety, all the health, all these kinds of things. That's a regulatory framework, which I think is core. And we who live in New York City know that without simple regulations like stoplights, we say who can go first and then who can take a turn, we would be a massive gridlock. We couldn't survive.
I agree. So oftentimes I've wanted traffic lights to go away when I'm stuck in a cab.
But you need them.
Yes, you do.
And so that's one part, which is the regulation. But the other part is there are many services that the market simply won't provide or provide adequately. So basic research, which is the basis of the growth of our economy, why our standard of living is higher than it was 50, 100, 150 years ago. The private market doesn't engage in adequate amounts of basic research. I talked about education for those who are poor. Right. So there are lots of goods and services.
And I want to go through some of those prescriptions that you go through. Besides talking about economic things, and you lay out in your book, 4 different reasons how we got to where we are today. And there are more things about monopolies that they've built. But in a human terms, and as you document and others have, a big swath of America has not seen their income gone up for decades now, even for a generation, to be blunt about it. And they feel like the system is rigged. So when they hear a Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump saying it's rigged, it resonates with them because they're not seeing any growth. They're seeing the wealthy get wealthier, and that's documented. That's actually true. And I have concerns in the long term for this country. If they no longer invest, they don't believe in the country. They're not going to vote anymore. It goes from income inequality, you talk about, to political inequality. and that we're run by essentially wealthy oligarchs in a way. What do you do? What do you say to people who have not seen their income gone up, the system is not working for them, and that what should they be calling on elected officials to change in 2020 to make part of the conversation, to make their lives really better? Not this BS better, but really I'm going to make things better for you.
Well, the point you make that it is very natural for people to say the economy is rigged and our political system is rigged.
Right.
And to be, almost angry that Donald Trump gets elected on a platform of draining the swamp, and then what do you see? The swamp has never been murkier, overflowing. And he criticizes the banks, and then he brings in a rash of the worst bankers that you could imagine. So there is real grounds for the discontent. There's only one way to respond to that, and to say we are still a democracy. Mm-hmm. We are a distorted democracy.
Sure.
There's voter suppression. We have gerrymandering. We have
super PACs that are legal to even $1 million.
We have money-driven politics. We've legalized it, but we still have a system where if enough people go out to vote, they can change our elected officials, and they can change the laws. And we can change the laws to curb, not eliminate, but curb the influence of money in our politics. And we can change the laws to curb the influence of money in our economy. Corporate power.
Sure.
One of the things that happened 100 and some years ago was we were at a moment where inequality was soaring. It was called the Gilded Age.
Sure.
And we had companies like Standard Oil, monopolies, and we passed laws. It was called the Progressive Era. And part of the reason of the choice of progressive capitalism is an echo back to that progressive era. We passed antitrust laws, the Sherman Antitrust Law, the Clayton Act, a series of laws, the intent of which was to curb the monopoly power, and it worked. We broke up Standard Oil, we broke up other monopolies, but then in the period 60s, 70s, a doctrine began to grow. And that doctrine is that markets are naturally competitive. We even forgot the reason that we passed this legislation, bipartisan, by the way, was not just economics, it was politics. There was a worry that we were going to lose our democratic politics, democratic in the sense that we were going to become overrun by a country of oligarchs, plutocrats. Right. And so it was more than just a little bit of economic efficiency. It was about the very fiber of our democracy. And the Chicago Economist did two things. One, they narrowed the scope to say, let's just look at economics, and then let's pretend that the economy is naturally competitive. So most of the time when you see something that looks anti-competitive, it's just the wonders of the market working themselves out, and you just sort of have to look at the glory of this wonderful artifice that we created. Well, what we've now discovered is that most of those things that look like they were anti-competitive, guess what? They were.
They weren't competitive.
And we now have an economy where we have large pockets of market domination, not only in the things that you see every day, the internet, telephone, airlines, drugs, and so forth, but even in little things like pet food and drugstores. You can have multiple drugstores with different names, all with the same ownership. So you don't even know that you're facing this kind of market power.
And why should the average person be concerned about this concentration of power in a handful of a smaller and smaller number of corporations in terms of their powers and also in terms of the price that we ultimately pay for these products?
Well, what happens when you have market power, you use it and increasingly abuse it.
Yeah.
So you raise prices and to the level you can get away with. In the case, there's a big distinction here between the United States and Europe. In the United States, we have a doctrine that says if you've legitimately acquired your monopoly power, your market power, for instance, a company buys the right to produce a drug, you can raise your prices 1,000%. No matter how important the drug is, people will die as a result.
Right.
You know, we don't balance any of that. We just say, if you've legitimately acquired market power, use it. In Europe, there's a doctrine called abuse of dominant power, abuse of market power. And so the kinds of things that we've seen in the United States with drug prices going up 1,000% doesn't happen in Europe because they say that's abusive.
So they put a cap on it.
They put a cap on it.
So is that what we need here? I mean, prescription drug prices, my mom is older, she's on prescription drugs, they keep going up. I've had stories of others. I've talked to countless people who are elected officials who spoke to seniors who said, they've talked to seniors who said, I have to decide whether I'm going to eat, literally have dinner or not, because I have to pay for my drugs because they keep going up in prices. Do we need the government to step in and put a caps on this?
Well, the basic point that I'm trying to focus on here is we have to have a real focus on abuse of market power. When Facebook takes away your privacy rights, it's because it has market power. And Germany is taking action to try to curb that kind of abuse of market power. When you go and sign up for a credit card or a telephone company or put a relative has to go into a nursing home, you sign a contract, and usually in that contract, you sign away your right to use public courts to adjudicate disputes, and disputes will arise.
Sure.
What you do is you go to arbitration. Arbitrators appointed by the companies, and these arbitrators work for the companies. So that's an example of market power, which you don't even think about when you sign the contract, but you have a dispute, and you will think about it.
Absolutely. And I'm a lawyer. I don't practice law anymore, but I used to deal with exact issues coming up, and trying to get out of those clauses are almost impossible.
And the Supreme Court has basically come down on the side of corporations. They said you should have read that fine print, as if you read that fine print, you wouldn't have time to do any work.
And they're not. And first of all, they're not going to change it anyway. They're going to tell you this is our standard clause, take it or leave it. And your grandma or mom doesn't go to the nursing home, and you're like, all right, I'll sign it.
Exactly. Or you go to the other internet company, and what do you find?
Same exact language.
Same. So what good does it do?
So you, in your book, though, it's not all hope is not lost here. In your book, you have a chapter on a decent life for all. I wish you called it a wonderful life for all, but I understand the decent point is, in there you talk about public options, and not just a healthcare public option, but in various areas. But let's go to the two that jump out at me. One is healthcare, because we've talked about that. How can a public option be helpful for people to get health care at less cost that's still good for them and it's still accessible?
So one of the things that we should have anticipated, and we've seen now in the last several years, is that there are in many parts of the country only 1, 2, or 3 health insurance companies, some places 0, limiting people's choice. But we said, you asked me before, what happens when there is limited choice? And then you have high market power. What do people do with market power? Raise prices. The notion of a public option is you would have a government program increasing people's choice, and the public isn't trying to rip off ordinary citizens. It's just trying to break even and provide services that people want. So the very existence of this public option would give people more choice, but also curb the monopoly power of the private sector. So it would lead to lower prices in the private sector, better than regulation in some ways, because it's giving somebody a choice, and making them think, how do I create alternatives that are preferable to what the government is providing. So to me, it will actually encourage innovation as well as lower prices.
And also the public option, if it's run by the government, let's say it's a health care plan, the CEO is not making $15 million. The public option is not sponsoring a stadium, for the New York Mets to play. So their money is focused, and it's much more limited in what they're going to use. They're not driven for profits or stock buybacks or driving up stock prices.
And they're not spending money, what I call cream skimming, trying to find out who are the lowest risk people and getting rid of the high risk people, putting them, say that's their problem.
So based on your experience, should 2020 Democrats be talking more about public option as opposed to Medicare for all?
That's my preference. I think the public option, you might say, is a more conservative to a fiduciary standard. That just means that when you sell a product, you should think about the interest of the person to whom you're selling the product. And the financial company said, no. We can only survive if we are allowed to exploit our conflicts of interest, pursue our interest over that of the client. To me, that was unimaginable.
We need to be predatory.
We need to be predatory.
It's remarkable.
The public option is to say we have a good retirement insurance program called Social Security. Right. It provides a kind of annuity that no private sector provides that guarantees against inflation. Not a problem now, but who knows in the future. So the idea here is that if you want to make a larger contribution to Social Security, you can do that. And that would increase your retirement benefits commensurately.
Sure.
So that's a public option. No salesman, you just go on and you make your additional contribution and you get additional benefits. Very simple.
These are.
Low cost.
And they're practical. They're not massive new program coming up. It's expanding.
No new bureaucracy. No new bureaucracy.
Right.
And the public Social Security programs, administrative costs are minuscule compared to private annuities.
At the end of your book, you have a chapter on reclaiming America. And you were pretty much optimistic, but at the same time, you warn us about the dark history of authoritarianism. When you see what Donald Trump is doing on a daily basis, literally today before we came on here, and tomorrow and the day after, he'll continue to attack our checks and balances, our institutions, and now stonewalling Congress to the point where he truly wants to be a king. Are you still as hopeful? I mean, and is he a cautionary tale that we can be hopeful, but we better be alert to history and what this man could become?
Very much so. In particular, I make some reference in the book to what happened in the 30s. And the parallel between what has been happening in the United States and the 30s is a little bit, more than a little bit, unnerving. Basically, the Nazis never won a majority of votes.
Right.
They seized control by having a minority, very similar to the minority that are the core Trump supporters, joined with the business community that said, well, we'll keep his excesses under control, but it will be very convenient for us to be good for business. And just the way so many of the business community have said, we'll overlook Trump's flaws, his undermining our democracy, his weakening of our systems of checks and balances. We'll even ignore the fact that even though historically we've been for globalization and the fact that he's for protection, we'll even look the other way on that. If we can just get a tax bill that gives a tax cut for corporations, a tax cut for the billionaires, even if a majority of Americans in the middle have to pay a higher tax rate, let's grab it.
Right.
And if we can get a deregulation to our finance sector, maybe an opportunity for another grand crisis like 2008. They don't talk about it that way, but remember, I was in a dinner with one of his people, and he was talking about enthusiasm of the deregulation, and somebody said, didn't we have a crisis in 2008? And wasn't that caused by the excesses of the banks? History doesn't, that was ancient history. And you talk about environmental regulation. We're headed for a crisis. And we need to accelerate our efforts.
Right.
And he's trying to roll them back.
It certainly is a wake-up call. Like you, I'm optimistic. I think our history allows us to be optimistic in this country, but at the same time, we must be aware of world history and where this can go. And thankfully, for those people who were engaged in 2018, we won the House of Representatives. We also flipped 7 governorships. And that showed if we come out big, we can correct things that are going the wrong way. But Joseph, I want to thank you for your time. And his new book, People, Power, and Profits, right here, a great book about progressive capitalism. All the terms we're hearing in the 2020 race, it's laid out here. It's laid out how we can be bold and progressive and change the country for the better. Don't be timid. This is not the time for timidity. Thank you, Joseph. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thanks for watching Salon Talks. I'm Dean Obeidallah.